So let's have a prayer. Let's close our eyes. Our Father in heaven, again, we do marvel at the wonderful way in which you look after us. How that you are the ones that feeds the birds of the air. How that you are the one that clothes the lilies of the valley. And how that we are knowledgeable that King Solomon and all of his array was not even as wonderfully dressed and looked after as the way in which you look after the lilies of the field. That we cannot clothe ourselves, we cannot look after ourselves in the manner in which you look after us. Thank you so much that as we consider the lilies and as we consider the birds of the air, how that our hope is inspired in us, that we who are of much more value to you than they are, won't you also, as your word says, pour out such an incredible blessing upon us. So help us not to be troubled, help us not to be despondent regarding the future, but help us to know that although the future sometimes is dark to us and maybe, frightening, that what is important is that the person who holds the future, which is you, dear Father, that you will also hold us in the palm of your mighty hand. We know that nothing happens without your foreknowledge, and not that your foreknowledge will intervene and change what is supposed to happen, but that you will give us, as we request from you, the strength that we need to be able to endure the moments. And you've promised that today you will be with us, that today, with all its worries and cares, you will give us the solution to it. So, Father in heaven, we come to you now, and we're asking you to help us to recognize something that needs to be there in our lives, that should be there and should remain there right up until when Jesus comes. And so as we study about Abram, that he believed God, that you will help us to learn something from this. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, dear friends, there are two scriptures that we are going to be going to tonight. As I indicated to you before, the heading of today's study is Abram, not Abraham. Abram believed God before. Now, what is the complete of that sentence? It would be Abram believed God before he was Abraham. Now, you will know that God changed his name from Abram to Abraham because his name change meant that he would now be the father of nations, just as Sarah's name meant that she would be the mother of nations. And dear friends, when I just consider Abraham, first of all, we know that he comes from a heathen country, that his parents were idol worshippers, but how that God saw in him somebody who would listen to God. I want you just to take note of the things that I'm telling you. And that is that the first criteria for a person in their lives is to come to a place where we listen to God, where we are obedient to him, where we've already made up our minds that, as Joshua said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And maybe tonight, as you have joined in with me and you're looking at this, I want you to know that long before you even became Abraham, you were already a child of God. So let me explain. I would like you to go with me to Genesis chapter 15, and we're going to look at verse 6. So Genesis chapter 15, and we're going to look at verse 6. Now, I want you to notice that the Lord approaches Abram, and it says in verse 1, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Now, what is so incredible about this? Here is Abram. He's a man who's just started a journey with God. But one of the things that is already a characteristic of Abram, and that is that when God spoke, when God called him, he responded by doing what God asked of him. But after he has had this discussion with God, and God has shown him the stars of the air, of the sky, Abram responds in verse 6. And it says, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So, dear friends, I want you to notice something right here. Even before Abram receives his change of name, the quality that endears him to God, that helps him to be that child of God, that righteous child, is the fact that Abram believed God. Now, I wonder how many people that are watching this study tonight and perhaps have found themselves to know of people in other churches who are truly, in the most beautiful way, the children of God. You see it in the way that they look and treat people, how merciful and how gracious they are. And yet many of them have shown by the way in which they treat others that although Abram, they are already declared, credited as righteous, because somehow in their lives they reveal that they've already been called to that beautiful service of love. And as a result of seeing that and being called to that, they acknowledge that as a result of what God has done through Christ, that they now have become children of God. And the interesting thing is that Jesus was once approached and said, your brothers and your mother and your sisters are outside looking for you. And Jesus said, who are my brothers, my sister, and my mother? And he said, those who do the will of my Father. And here we see how that Abram, when God calls him, heeds to the call of God and goes and leaves the country that he knew, which was home. And he goes out into the future, not knowing at all what God had planned for him. But the beautiful thing is that in the relationship that Abraham had with God was that he believed the words of God. And, you know, we get a lot of other information that comes out here that is incredible. First of all, God always honors those who heed his call. He promised to be with Abraham in the beginning, and he remains faithful to that promise right throughout the life of Abraham. And we know of various occasions where how that he, after being called by God, after listening to God, does the weirdest things. He lies. He calls his wife his sister in order not to be killed, so he thought. But how that God shows through what he does there with Pharaoh, reveals to him that Sarah belongs to Abraham, and how that the Pharaoh, instead of going out to kill him, you know, God warns him that he's my servant. And he returns Sarah back and he says, how did you, Pharaoh says to Abraham, you caused me to sin against God. And then he gives him a lot of riches and he sends him on his way. And there, even though Abraham had for a moment kind of went on his own journey, God never left him. And as we go on, I think one of the things that we've really got to have with us from the beginning of our walk with God right up until the very end is this one thing. and that is that when God speaks, we believe his word. In John chapter 3, verse 33, we are told very clearly that, or is it verse 31? I can't think offhand now, that it says that part of our experience as God's children is to, by the acceptance of God, what God has said, prove to him that we believe that his words are truthful. That when he asks us to do something, the reason why we do it is because we believe in the credibility of God's words. And it's amazing that although Abram, it says, believed God, he credited to God the fact that he believed that God would do what he said. And as a result of that belief, it says that God credited that very act of his in his favor, in Abram's favor, and declared him to be a righteous man. Now, right throughout his life, Abram always believed God, even when he became Abraham. And I want you to take note of something. And that is that I want us to now jump over to the next book, and we're going to go to the book of Hebrews. And we're going to go to Hebrews chapter 11. And most of you know what that chapter is all about. It is, in my Bible, the heading that I have at the top of that particular chapter is Faith in Action. Now, I want you to notice something that we are told about Abram, and I would like you to look at this with me. In verse 8, now remember that Hebrews chapter 11 is dedicated to exonerating or putting forward those people who, without doubt, without question, have the plan of salvation. They have been sealed as the children of God. And in verse 8, I want you to notice we are going to get a little bit of a glimpse into the life of Abram, but almost a shorter version of what Abram was all about. But in the case, it says here, and I want you to notice verse 8 says, by faith, Abraham, notice that. He's not referred to as Abram here, but as Abraham. So we are looking at Abraham, the person of God, the one whom God had now given a new name to, that he'll be the father of nations. We read there in verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed even though he did not know where he was going. Do you pick up the key word here? He obeyed. What made him obey? Because he believed God. And the interesting thing about Abraham, even though he was in the land of Canaan, it was not yet his property. But by faith he accepted it, that God who had promised it to him would give it, but only later were his offspring to have it. Then it says in verse 9, by faith he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith Sarah, who was past childbirth, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Isn't that amazing that here we find Sarah is also declared as the person who believed God, and because of her belief in God, she was granted to have child. She believed God. And this is so amazing to me. And then I want you to notice that verse 12 says, and so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as countless as the sands of the seashore. And so I want you to notice something here, that both Abram and Sarah, in their relationship, first of all, to God, the main character quality of their relationship was that they believed God, and it was credited to them as righteousness. Now, the next verse that I'd like to take you to, because I want you to recognize that from the time that Abram was Abram to the time when he was Abraham, the quality that made him stand out is that he was obedient, and he was obedient because he believed God. You know, dear friends, I want to tell you this. Sometimes I believe that the reason why we keep the commandments of God, or should be why we keep the commandments of God, and that is because we believe that God's words are credit-worthy. And I want you to understand this. In some way, if we don't believe the words of God, we will truthfully never be obedient to them. But if we believe that the words that God has spoken are in granite, that they came out of his mouth and they will never return to him empty, it's on the strength of that understanding that faith is established. If God, for example, had promised to be with Abram, but never gave him an heir like he promised, then Abram would not have been able to build his faith in God, because the words of God would not have been creditworthy. And I want you just to notice something here that's so important. When we are dealing with others and we tell them that we are going to do something, or we tell them about something, they must never in any way be able to find that what we have discussed with them was not truthful. I find so many times that we want people to believe in us, in the truths that we have, when our own life makes them draw question to that. Let me explain. Many years ago, and this really stands out as one of the most vivid things in my mind, many years ago, our church wanted to run a evangelistic program in a very, how can I say, country village. Here we will call it a dorpie. And most of your country kind of cities or towns, in the center of those towns, you would find a Dutch Reformed church. And the person who was the shepherd of those churches are known as dominees. Now, they used to dress in a very specific code. The code would be, a black suit, and then they would have a white shirt with a white tie, with their black shoes, and sometimes even white socks. But that would be almost the clothing that you would expect of a Dutch Reformed minister. But because it was the Seventh-day Adventist Church that was attempting to reach out, they didn't want to, so they thought, draw question or make people already question the church because of the view that people had, especially the Dutch Reformed Church, regarding the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that they didn't want to, on the offset, put people off from attending the evangelistic programs. So instead of being, in a sense, honest when they gave titles as they put out their flyers and their advertising, the guest speaker, who was a Seventh-day Adventist and normally would be referred to as a pastor, in Afrikaans would be a leraar, they, because of prejudice, decided to put DS in front of the speaker's name, which was actually an abbreviation for dominee. And so they put this on all the posters, advertised, and then they booked the civic hall. the day came for this, the start of the evangelistic program, and it was packed to capacity. It's almost as if the whole countryside, because obviously most of the little towns were made of farmers who would come into town, and it was packed to capacity. And the people, especially the church organizers, were so in their element, and they were praising God for, helping them to have such a wonderful response. So after that, been a little bit of singing, and they were just about to get started when the speaker came onto the platform, and he was dressed with his black suit, white tie, white shirt, black socks, and white socks and black shoes. And he reflected the image of the dominee. And as he walked down, everybody was very somber. Everybody was very, aware that God had really moved in a wonderful way. But just when the proceedings was about to start, a minister, the actual Dutch Reformed minister of that particular church, the Dutch Reformed Church, stood up, and he had a black suit on with a white tie and white, and everybody in the audience knew him because he was the local minister, the local dominee. And he asked if he could just ask one simple question before there was any further procedures. And so they said, of course. And his question was, what church do you represent there on the platform? He says, because we're not clear when it comes to your advertising. Your advertising clearly indicates that you are a dominee. Secondly, by your dress code and the way that you are have dressed yourself on the stage there, you look like a dominee. And so therefore I'm just asking, what church are you representing? And immediately I recall how that when this person was telling me this whole story, that he was very, not concerned, he was very humbled. He told me that in order to be honest, he said that it is a Seventh-day Adventist outreach evangelistic program. And immediately the dominee then went on to say, if you lied about your title, and if you lied in your dress code as to who you are, how can we believe that the words that you're going to speak now are truthfully the words of God, and that we can put our confidence in that? And that was one of the most important lessons our church learned. And that is that if you want to get people to believe, your words need to be trustworthy. And here we see how that God, with Abram and with Sarai, who were both, heathen in their practices, how that they showed what the quality is that is needed to be a child of God. They believed in the words of God. They placed their confidence in His words. And when God said to Abram that your descendants will be as the stars, it says that even Sarah believed the words of God. So before it was even fulfilled, the quality that made them actually be in fullness the children of God was that they believed. So going back to my introduction verse, I want you to notice something. Abram believed God before he was Abraham. So I want you to look at it this way. Before you even received the new name of God, like Jacob became Israel, we are going to receive new names. So we are told. Before we even receive the new name, the first thing that we, in our heathen name, need to do is to believe the words of God. So tonight I want to leave this with you. From beginning to the end of your life's experience on planet Earth and your walk with God, you need to believe every word that comes out of the mouth of God. To finish off, I'd like to draw your attention to John chapter 14, where Jesus says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." And dear friends, when we believe in God and we believe also in Jesus, then what they have promised will definitely be fulfilled in our lives. So even though you are an Abram, you will already be behaving like an Abraham.